Dykes here with Infowars.com on a new YouTube blog, The Frontline Reports. Check this new blog out for spontaneous stuff with Alex Jones, as well as some of my analysis. I'm going to, among other things, try to break down a lot of the important New World Order books that we've covered over the ages and try to give you more detail, some of the pertinent quotes. Today, I want to talk about the battle between man and machine. Right here, I've got a headline from one of the Apple co-founders, Steve Wozniak, printed in The Age, that's the Australian paper, this week, June 6, 2011. Humans become pets in the rise of the machines. Apple co-founder. And why is this important? Because obviously our human destiny has been threatened and has otherwise been sold out already by the elites for more than 100 years. And now, of course, many of the technological supervisors, the overlords of our world, have recognized that machines, quote, have won the war and the human race is destined to become little more than house pets. And in terms of power dynamics and political importance in our society, being a house pet is no better at all than being a slave. Of course, it means you might get good treatment, but that's about it. You have no meaningful power over your life or over human destiny. Steve Wozniak goes on to say, every time we create new technology, we're creating stuff to do the work we used to do, and we're making ourselves less meaningful, less relevant. Why are we going to need ourselves so much in the future? We can just have the easy life. Unfortunately, it's not true that we can just have the easy life. That's something, however, they want us to believe. And no, it's not going to be a battle, probably anyway, on the scale of Terminator, where you see actual physical fights between man and machines, but instead you're going to see a displacement of individual importance. The only problem is the elites set that in place more than a century ago, and our problems with technology and what happens with technology has a spiritual knowledge of its own that exceeds or matches human ability, is that we've already been displaced by the elites. And if we don't take on the elite scientific dictatorship that's been put into place since the early 1900s, we're never going to get back any of that human destiny. We already have articles from 2004, Wired Magazine, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, by Sun Microsystems executive Bill Joy. He deals with the scenario laid out in Ray Kurzweil's seminal book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. In other words, what happens when computers exceed human intelligence. And the scenario they both observe and obviously think is important, is clearly critical, is one written by none other than the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. But it doesn't detract from the importance of what he's written about, the technological scenarios. Kaczynski writes about, and Bill Joy and Ray Kurzweil both observe, what we do suggest is that the human race might easily permit itself to drift into a position of such dependence on machines it would have no practical choice but to accept all of the machine's decisions. Further, the average man may only have control over certain private machines of his own, such as a car or a personal computer, but control over large systems of machines will be in the hands of a tiny elite, just as today. The key is just as today. You see, this fight is addressed by Bill Joy as the new Luddite challenge. The Luddites were somewhat obscure resistors to the culmination of the Industrial Revolution, and they oppose all these industrialized machines because they thought it would displace the value of human labor. There's a lot of pros and cons to that, and of course technology plays a great role in our life. They certainly had a point. They decided to burn down their factory at the time and try to oppose, the coming of the age of industrial machinery. That didn't go so well for them, and you always have to question those kinds of extreme tactics. But at the same time, there's a clear choice for our future, and it isn't pretty. It is, as Kaczynski outlines, that human work will no longer be necessary. The masses will be superfluous, a useless burden on the system. If the elite is ruthless, they may simply decide to exterminate the mass of humanity. If they are humane, they may use propaganda or other psychological or biological techniques to reduce the birth rate until the mass of humanity becomes extinct, leaving the world to the elite. Or if the elite consist of soft-hearted liberals, they may decide to play the role of good shepherds to the rest of the human race. But, as they point out in the Steve Wozniak article, that will reduce ordinary people to mere pets. And of course, what happens when machines become more sophisticated and they may displace even the elites that we already have ruling our lives? Well, of course, there are importances to the technological challenge, but the key for ordinary people in this time is we have to oppose these elites, stop these globalists who, as identified in this scenario, want us either exterminated or to reduce our population as they kindly manage us. This is not a new scenario just for the 21st century and the computer age. It was, of course, identified by the Fabian socialists of the early 1900s, which George Orwell was a part of that group, the Fabian socialists, and he outlines within 1984 that the real enemy is oligarchical collectivism. That is, elites who rule the collectivist systems put in place all over the world. And of course, we have to face the very critical fact that ever since the beginning of the 20th century, even the so-called capitalist democratic republic of the United States has been a carefully managed society which is collectivist and oligarchical, just as Soviet Russia, just as various parts of Europe and other parts of the world. Let's look at this quote regarding our possible future as mere pets in George Bernard Shaw. He said, "Under socialism, you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed, whether you like it or not. And if it were discovered that you had not character enough to be worth all this trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner." In a kindly manner, that's being pets in a society that's managed by elites. We have to simply face the fact that ever since the culmination of the Industrial Revolution, certain monopoly men, very iconically in America, took control of all the major industry and used that power to steer politics, society, culture, education, everything down to our individual choices, what kind of technology would rise. And that has been devastating ever since, as groups like the Rockefeller Foundation, groups like the Ford Foundation, have put in massive amounts of money to steer the direction of science and research, technology development. That's one reason that even if there was a way to avoid the scenario of computers taking us over, displacing our human lives, and either making us pets or wiping us out, we don't have any control over that until we get control over the elites who are dominating our society. Let's look at Edward Bernays, his book Propaganda from 1927. Two-paragraph quote from page 1 of chapter 1, Organizing Chaos. Edward Bernays, the cousin of Sigmund Freud, and one of the main developers of our commercialized 21st century American society, wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed. Our minds are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." And he goes on to say that's a logical result and somehow a part of a, quote, democratic society. Well, no, it isn't. These globalists have been steering as many of the major choices as they can for a long time, but they only dominate our lives. They don't control every aspect. But it's still the biggest challenge we have to face, and if we don't face up to the important aspects of the scenario discussed by Kurzweil, Bill Joy, by Steve Wozniak, and even Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, we're never going to have any individual freedom again, and our lives are going to pay for it because we will be, as it says right here, superfluous and either exterminated or kept as they reduce our population. That is a vision that's been put in place, of course, as I said, by the Fabian socialists, by the technocratic elite from the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century. These are both H.G. Wells' books, The New World Order, The Open Conspiracy. This is, of course, Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited, which foresees a technocratic elite, which conveys a Ford-like assembly line production of human lives, total dominance over reproduction, division of labor into a caste system, and most of all, a distracted population which enjoys being drugged up and put forward bread and circus, the important aspects of the scenario discussed by Kurzweil, Bill Joy, by Steve Wozniak, and even Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. We're never going to have any individual freedom again, and our lives are going to pay for it, because we will be, as it says right here, superfluous and either exterminated or kept as they reduce our population. That is a vision that's been put in place, of course, as I said, by the Fabian socialists, by the technocratic elite from the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century. These are both H.G. Wells' books, The New World Order, The Open Conspiracy. This is, of course, Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited, which foresees a technocratic elite, which conveys a Ford-like assembly line production of human lives, total dominance over reproduction, division of labor into a caste system, and most of all, a distracted population which enjoys being drugged up and put forward bread and circuses, but who have no real meaningful distinction over their own lives. And that's really the key that we're talking about. Also among these elites are Bertrand Russell, his very key book, The Impact of Science on Society from the early 1950s. I'm going to read you several of those quotes, and you'll see why the rise of the machines is not the only problem we face. The rise of the elites over 100 years ago in our modern society is something we must face, or we'll have no control regardless of what the computers do in the future. Bertrand Russell, from The Impact of Science on Society, 1953. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The population will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. I just read you the same conclusion from Edward Bernays in Propaganda, 1927. Bertrand Russell also writes that it is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over individual mentality than they have today, even in totalitarian countries. Fitch laid it down that education should aim at destroying free will. Fitch is one of the followers of the 1800s era, Hegel. Hegel, who basically reduced humanity's importance to a simple cog in the machine. Now that we face the rise of the machines, it's more important than ever what the elites had in mind when they decided that individuals would be a mere cog in the machine. More from Bertrand Russell. Gradually, by selective breeding, the congenital differences between rulers and ruled will increase until they become almost a different species. Just as people like Kurzweil predicted that in the age of spiritual machines, basically the elite and the others who can afford to keep pace will eventually merge with technology, where they may somehow have a co-equal role. But again, ordinary people would be reduced either directly in numbers or kept. Now, going on for Bertrand Russell, a revolt of the plebs would become as unthinkable as an organized insurrection of sheep against the practice of eating mutton. That's right, we're going to be pets, we're going to be sheep, and they believe there'll be nothing we can do to fight back against the society. Furthermore, Bertrand Russell writes, one kind of education will be given for ordinary men and women, another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. And what will happen in this society of carefully managed economic, social, and political factors, where regional governments are formed, where varying regions are merged together under United Nations-style agreements, GATT and NAFTA agreements, IMF, so on and so forth. Much of Europe is controlled by the Office of Economic Cooperative Development. Bertrand Russell writes that a rogue individual would be forced to join or die the Borg hive. And that's part of this important question. He writes, on those rare occasions when a boy or girl who has passed the age at which it is usual to determine social status shows a marked ability as to seem as an intellectual equal of the rulers, the youth is content to it'll raise serious questions, rather. If the youth is content to abandon his previous associates and to throw in his lot wholeheartedly with the rulers, he may, after suitable tests, be promoted and otherwise accepted into that society. But if he shows any regrettable solidarity with his previous associates, that is, the ordinary people he was born amongst, already a caste system here, the rulers will reluctantly conclude that there is nothing to be done with him except to send him to the lethal chamber. That's from Bertrand Russell in 1931 from the Scientific Outlook. The rest of the quote's from The Impact of Science on Society. But the end conclusion is the same, that the rise of the scientifically managed class of technical and elite rulers has already long ago reduced ordinary people and our role in society to very close to nil. We still have bread and circuses, other enjoyments. We have the leisure and access to computers and modern technology, but the true controls are steered by the elite managed foundations, and we have a serious quest ahead of us as the rise of machines makes that elite disparity even worse for ordinary people. But the important thing is it still matters that we stand up, fight back, and say no. Obviously, they still care what we think because they're spending billions and billions every year to form our opinion. And if the mass of society were to reject that opinion, although they already dominate the goings-on, they would be challenged significantly, and we could still fight back. It's not too late. Infowars.com.